In 1922, a Boston fruit merchant named James Dole bought an entire Hawaiian island. He paid roughly $1 million for 98% of Lanai, some 90,000 acres, the sixth largest island in the chain, and within 10 years he had lost all of it, along with the company that carried his name. But the island had been taken from its first people long before any fruit merchant arrived, and the empire Dole lost did not end when he did. It changed products, and it changed masters, from pineapple to tourism to the private experiment of a single billionaire for the better part of 100 years, and it never once returned to the people who had lived there first. By 1930, this one island stood at the center of an empire that grew 3/4 of the world's pineapple. Hundreds of millions of plants stood in its red fields. 65,000 tons of fruit came out of it in a single year. The canneries it fed filled over 100 million cans, shipped to the mainland through a harbor that had been blasted, ton by ton, out of solid cliff. A century later, the fields lay fallow, the fruit was gone, and almost the whole of Lanai belonged to one man. A man who, for a single day in the autumn of 2025, stood as the richest human being alive. Before the rest of this story begins, I want to know one thing from the people watching tonight. Nearly everyone recognizes the name Dole. For most, it is a can of pineapple on a grocery shelf, a yellow label, a fruit, and little more. Far fewer know that the same name once belonged to a man who bought a whole island and then lost it inside a decade. So tell me, down in the comments, which Dole you knew before tonight? The fruit or the man? I would like to know which one you carried in with you. Chapter 1. The Ground That Was Taken. The island is called Lanai. It sits in the rain shadow of its larger neighbors, Maui to the east and Molokai to the north, a dry red upland of some 140 square miles, and for most of the last 100 years it has held a distinction shared by almost no other inhabited place in the United States. It has belonged, very nearly in its entirety, to one owner at a time. There have been 4 of them. First, the fruit merchant, James Drummond Dole, who turned the island into the largest single pineapple plantation on Earth. Then the corporation that took the island from him, Castle and Cooke, one of the old sugar houses of Honolulu, which held Lanai as a subsidiary for half a century. Then a mainland financier named David Murdoch, who ended the pineapple and tried to sell the island a second life as a luxury retreat. And finally, Larry Ellison, the co-founder of the software company Oracle, who in 2012 bought 98% of Lanai the way another man might buy a house. The products changed. The island grew pineapple, and then it sold golf and silence, and then it began to market wellness and organic farming to the very wealthy. The masters changed 4 times in a century. But the essential arrangement never changed at all. Lanai was owned. The people who lived on it, and the people whose ancestors had lived on it long before any of the 4 arrived, did not own it. They worked it, and they rented from it, and they drew their wages from whoever happened to hold the deed. That arrangement did not begin with the pineapple. It is older than the plantation, older than the company, older than the men whose names would be stamped on the fruit and the hotels. Before Lanai could be bought at all, the ground beneath it had to be made into something that could be sold. In the 1840s, the Kingdom of Hawaii undertook a reform that its foreign advisers called the Great Mahele, a division of lands that converted the communal holdings of the Hawaiian people into private property, parcels that could be surveyed, titled, mortgaged, and sold to strangers. When the awards that followed were finished, the common people of Hawaii, who had actually worked the land, held title to less than 1% of it. In 1893, a small circle of American businessmen, many of them the sons and grandsons of Protestant missionaries, overthrew the Hawaiian queen and declared a republic. That is a story for another night, and it belongs to the men who made it. What matters here is only its consequence. When the monarchy fell, the land of a sovereign kingdom became land that a foreign fruit merchant could one day walk into an office in Honolulu and purchase outright. So when James Dole bought Lanai in 1922, he was not buying an empty island. He was buying the far end of a taking that had begun before he was born, a taking the United States government itself would one day acknowledge. A full century after the Mahele in 1993, Congress passed a formal apology to the Hawaiian people, a single paragraph of law conceding that they had never directly relinquished to the United States their claims to their inherent sovereignty. No land was returned. The apology was a paragraph, and the island remained what it had been for 100 years. In the present day, the roughly 3,000 people who live on Lanai buy their groceries from a store the owner controls, draw their water from a system the owner controls, and sleep, most of them, in houses the owner rents to them. The pattern the Mahele began in the 1840s did not close in the past. On Lanai, it is the condition of the present. This is the story of that island, and of the 4 men and companies who came to own it, and of the people who spent their lives on ground that was never quite theirs. It begins, as the trouble on Lanai always seemed to begin, with the question of who would want such a place at all. Chapter 2. The Unwanted Island. For as long as people had lived in the Hawaiian Islands, Lanai had been a place to be sent, not a place to go. In the old stories, it was the haunt of evil spirits, the Akua Ino, and no one would settle there. The legend tells of a chief's son named Kaululaau, a boy from Maui so wild and destructive that his own father banished him across the channel to Lanai, expecting the ghosts to finish what discipline could not. Instead, the boy outwitted them, one by one, and drove them into the sea, and only then, the stories say, could human beings live on the island at all. It is a founding legend, unlike almost any other in Hawaii. Lanai was not discovered, and it was not settled. It was cleared of its terrors, and even afterward it was never entirely trusted. The history that followed did little to soften the island's reputation. During the wars that united the Hawaiian kingdom in the late 1700s, Lanai's people were slaughtered in raids from the larger islands, and when the British navigator George Vancouver passed its shores in 1792, he recorded a coastline that looked all but empty of life. The population never fully recovered. Where perhaps 1,200 people had lived on Lanai in the 1830s, barely 130 remained by 1910. The island was dry, its forests thinning, its water scarce and sinking further with every decade. And into that hard, half-deserted place came a long procession of outsiders, each convinced that he alone could make it yield. The first were missionaries. In 1854, a group of Hawaiian converts to the Mormon faith founded a colony in the island's central crater, the Palawai Basin, and named it the City of Joseph. They planted corn and sugar cane and struggled against the enemy that would defeat everyone who came after them, the absence of water. Then, in 1861, a self-styled leader named Walter Murray Gibson arrived to take charge of the colony, and its purpose quietly began to change. Gibson used the church's money to buy up the best land in the basin, and he registered the deeds not in the name of the church, but in his own. When a committee arrived from Utah to investigate, he refused to give the land back and was promptly excommunicated. The faithful drifted away. Gibson stayed and kept the island. He had grand designs for it. He dreamed of filling the crater with orchards and settlers and calling it a paradise. "I would make millions of fruits where one was never thought of," he wrote, half a century before another man would do exactly that, with a fruit Gibson never imagined. But his own ventures came to little. He turned to sheep and cattle, and then to politics in Honolulu, where he rose to become premier of the kingdom before dying deep in debt. His Lanai lands long since mortgaged away to sugarmen on other islands. His heirs tried sugar. At the turn of the century, Gibson's daughter and her husband formed the Maunalei Sugar Company and laid out cane fields on the island's windward slope. The crop came up. Then the wells turned brackish, the fresh water failing as it always failed on Lanai, and by 1901 the company had collapsed. Some on the island said the planters had disturbed ground they should have left alone, and that the old spirits had answered. The more practical explanation was the one that had governed Lanai from the beginning. There was not enough water, and there never would be. The windward village the company had raised up, Keomoku, held on a few decades more, and then emptied until almost nothing of it was left. A small wooden church still stands among the kiawe trees, the last building of the town, and just off the shore below it, the remains of the boat that once ferried the village to Maui and back lie half sunk in the red mud, where they have settled for the better part of a century. What remained was cattle. The land passed through foreclosures and mortgages until it came to rest with the Baldwin family of Maui, one of the old sugar dynasties who ran it as a ranch. Thousands of head of livestock grazing a landscape the animals themselves had helped to strip bare. By the early 1920s, Lanai was very nearly what it had always been, a dry red island that had defeated every man who ever tried to own it, worth little and wanted by almost no one. And then, in 1922, a fruit merchant from Boston looked at that island and saw a fortune where 4 generations of others had seen only failure. Chapter 3. The Pineapple King. The fruit merchant's name was James Drummond Dole, and almost nothing about him suggested a man who would one day corner a global market. He was born in 1877 in Jamaica Plain, outside Boston, the son of a Unitarian minister, raised on sermons and books and the thin salary of a New England clergyman. He took a degree in agriculture from Harvard, and in the autumn of 1899, at 22 years of age, with about $1,500 to his name and a vague intention of growing coffee, he sailed for Hawaii. He arrived into a strange moment. Within 2 weeks of his landing, Honolulu was quarantined for bubonic plague, and that winter Dole watched the fire department deliberately burn down the city's Chinatown, a sanitary measure that escaped its intended boundaries and consumed dozens of blocks. It was not a gentle introduction to the islands, but it is what happened before his arrival that matters most to this story, because it is the fact most often gotten wrong. 6 years earlier, in 1893, a small group of American businessmen had overthrown the Hawaiian queen. One of the leaders of that overthrow, and the first president of the republic they raised on the ruins of her kingdom, was a man named Sanford Dole. He was James Dole's cousin, and when James stepped off the boat in 1899, it was Sanford who governed Hawaii, and Sanford with whom James first lodged. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to fold the 2 men into one. Sanford Dole was the son of a Protestant missionary, a lawyer, a politician, and the architect of a coup. James Dole was a minister's son from Boston who had come to grow fruit. He had no part in the overthrow, and he never claimed one. The taking of the islands was the work of an older generation, of the missionary families whose children had traded the pulpit for the plantation and the statehouse. James arrived to inherit the world they had made, not to make it. That distinction will matter later. For now, it is enough to say that he came with a fruit, a stubbornness, and very little else. In 1900, he bought a homestead of 64 acres on the dry central plateau of Oahu at a place called Wahiawa, and the following year, at 24, he founded the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. The verdict of respectable Honolulu was swift and unkind. The local paper dismissed the whole idea as a foolhardy venture, one that had been tried before and had failed before and would certainly fail again. Pineapple did not travel. It spoiled on the long crossing to the mainland, and a pineapple picked green would never ripen. The men who knew the islands knew it could not be done. Dole did it anyway, by refusing the premise. He picked the fruit ripe, canned it on the island before it could spoil, and shipped the cans instead of the fruit. His first pack, in 1903, came to fewer than 2,000 cases. Then the machinery caught up to the ambition. In 1911, he hired an engineer named Henry Jinaka to break the last bottleneck in the cannery, the slow labor of peeling and coring by hand. Jinaka built him a machine that could peel and core 35 pineapples a minute, and later as many as 100, work that had once filled a room with laborers now done by a single turning mechanism. Where the first pack had been 2,000 cases, the industry Dole led would soon ship its fruit by the hundreds of thousands, and then the millions. When a financial panic on the mainland cut into demand, Dole became the prime mover behind a cooperative advertising campaign in the continental press, one of the early efforts of its kind for an American food, teaching a country that had barely tasted the fruit to want it. The demand for Hawaiian pineapple revived and climbed. There was one thing Dole would not do, at least not yet. In 1910, his cousin Sanford had written to him asking that he keep the family name off the product. The name, Sanford reminded him, had long been associated with religious, educational, and philanthropic enterprises, and he did not wish to see it stamped upon a can. For years, James obeyed. The word Dole would not appear on a label until 1927. A name meant, in the mind of the man who bore it most proudly, for the pulpit and the schoolhouse would in time be printed on more than 100 million cans a year. By then, Dole needed more than Oahu could give him. His market was growing faster than his land, and there was, not far to the southeast, an entire island for sale. Chapter 4. $1 million for an island. An island is not an ordinary thing to buy. A farm can be bought, a house, a single block of a city. But an entire island, with its harbors and its ridgelines and its weather, with whatever people happen to live upon it, is a purchase of a different order, closer to the acquisition of a small country than of a piece of property. In 1922, James Dole made exactly that purchase, and the way he made it would matter more in the end than the island itself. He had been leasing land on Oahu for years, and it was no longer enough. His market was outrunning his acreage, and so he turned to Lanai, the dry, red island the Baldwin family of Maui had been holding as a cattle ranch, and he bought them out. The figures were staggering for a single private company. Dole acquired 98% of Lanai, some 90,000 acres, the sixth largest island in the Hawaiian chain, for $1,100,000. Almost the whole of an island, roughly 140 square miles of it, passed into the hands of one pineapple company in a single transaction. Overnight, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company controlled more planting ground than any pineapple concern on earth, and took back the first place in the industry it had briefly lost to a California rival. But Dole did not have $1 million lying in a drawer, and this is the part of the story that would come back for him. To raise the money, he did not borrow it. He sold a piece of himself. In exchange for cash and a 17-year lease on additional Oahu land, Dole handed a one-third interest in the Hawaiian Pineapple Company to the Waialua Agricultural Company, an enterprise controlled by the old Honolulu sugar house of Castle and Cooke. With the cash, $1.25 million of it, he bought his island. It was, on its face, a clever arrangement. Dole got Lanai and kept command of his company, since one-third was not a majority, and Castle and Cooke got a stake in the fastest-growing agricultural business in the territory. But a one-third interest is not nothing. It came with seats on the board of directors, and a permanent voice in the direction of the company, and a patience that could afford to wait. Dole had bought an island. He had also, without quite seeing it, invited into his own boardroom the men who would one day take everything he had built. The fuse was lit in 1922. It would burn for 10 years. For the moment, none of that was visible. What was visible was triumph. On mainland radio, the company's own advertising told a whole country it could thank Jim Dole for canned pineapples, and the country, more or less, did. He was the Pineapple King, and he had bought a kingdom to match the title. There is one more thing to notice about the purchase, quietly, because the story will return to it. The sale of Lanai was, by every legal measure, clean. The Baldwins were willing sellers. Dole was a willing buyer. A price was named and paid. A deed was signed and recorded, and the island changed hands the way any parcel of property changes hands. And yet the thing being bought and sold, the ground itself, had been made into private saleable property only 2 generations earlier, by a division of lands and an overthrow that the people who had first lived on Lanai never agreed to. They were party to none of it, not to the Mahele, not to the overthrow, not to the sale. The island was sold cleanly by men who had come to own it, over the heads of the people to whom it had once simply belonged. Dole now held 90,000 acres of dry rock and red dust, with barely 100 souls living on it and almost no fresh water. To make it the largest pineapple plantation in the world, he would have to build everything the island did not have: a harbor, a town, and, above all, a workforce, carried in across the sea, one boat at a time. Chapter 5. The Imported Island. Everything on Lanai had to be brought in. The island had almost no fresh water, no harbor a ship could tie up to, no town, and almost no people. To grow pineapple on it, Dole's company would have to manufacture the conditions for a plantation the way a factory manufactures a product. And so, beginning in 1923, it did. On the island's western cliffs, where the land dropped straight into the sea, the company blasted out a harbor. Crews broke apart a rock face 65 feet deep, hauled away 116,000 tons of stone, and threw the rubble into the ocean to form a breakwater, and where there had been only cliff and surf, they built Kaumalapau Harbor, the single lifeline through which everything the island produced would leave, and everything it needed would arrive. From the harbor they cut a road 7 miles long, climbing 1,600 feet through the fields to a place that did not yet exist, a town. They called it Lanai City, and they laid it out on a grid in the cool uplands. The company built houses and then schools, churches, a hospital, ball fields, a swimming pool, a theater. In 1923 it put up a small lodge to house the executives who came to oversee the fruit, the Hotel Lanai, which would remain the only hotel on the island for the next 67 years. And, to answer the oldest problem of all, the water, the company turned to a ranch manager named George Monroe, who had noticed that the tall Cooke pines pulled moisture out of the fog and let it fall as a slow rain beneath their branches. Monroe planted them by the thousands along the ridges and through the town, and the trees drank the clouds and watered the island that had never had enough. Many of them are standing yet. A share of Lanai's water still drips to this day from pines a ranch hand set in the ground a century ago. But a plantation is not a harbor or a town. A plantation is people, and Lanai had almost none, so the company imported them. They came across the Pacific by the thousands, most of them from the Philippines, and after them from Japan, from Korea, from China, from Portugal, from Puerto Rico, drawn by the promise of a wage and a way out of the poverty they had left behind. On Lanai, they were housed in camps, and the camps were arranged by nationality. Filipino in one quarter, Japanese in another, each people kept to its own. The company explained this as a kindness, a way for every group to hold on to its language and its customs. It also ensured that no two peoples would easily combine, and that was not an accident. Across the territory, the great planters had learned to bring in one nationality to check the bargaining power of the last, and the secretary of the Sugar Planters Association had told Congress plainly what the whole arrangement was for. The Americans in Hawaii, he said, are going to dominate and will dominate. The work was hard and the pay was small. Men and women rose before dawn, 6 days a week, and bent over the rows in the sun and the fine red dust, setting as many as 10,000 pineapple crowns in a day, everyone by hand, for something close to $1 a day. The company owned the houses they slept in and the store where they spent their wages. On a rise above the town stood the larger homes of the field bosses and managers, a neighborhood the workers' children called Snob Hill, and whose children they did not mix with. Under James Dole, in all his years on the island, there was never a strike. The control was total, and it did not need to raise its voice. And yet the people who came to Lanai did more than endure it. Inside the camps, a world grew up, loud and close and alive, of baseball games and weddings and church suppers, of families who lifted one another across the very lines the company had drawn between them. The island's own heritage center still keeps the memory of one of them, a Hawaiian Pineapple Company worker remembered simply as Ito, who in the hours he was not in the fields tended a garden across the road from his house on Queen Street and widened it season by season into terraces of flowers, kept not for sale and not for the company, but for anyone at all who cared to look. They fished the same water their grandparents' had fished. They buried their dead on the island. They stayed. That is the part of this story that does not end. The roughly 3,000 people who live on Lanai today are, in large measure, the descendants of the men and women Dole carried across the ocean in the 1920s, the Filipino and Japanese and Portuguese and Puerto Rican families who blasted the harbor and raised the town and worked the fields. Their great-grandchildren walk the same grid of streets. And so, before this story goes any further, I want to hear from them. If your family came to Lanai in those years, if your grandparents or great-grandparents worked Dole's fields or lived in one of those camps, write down the name they carried and the place they came from. Say where your people settled and what they built. This is their record as much as anyone's, and the comments below are the right place to keep it. For the families who came, the island was slowly becoming home. For the company that brought them, it was becoming something else entirely. By 1930, one small island in the middle of the ocean stood at the center of a global empire of fruit. Chapter 6. The Kingdom. By 1930, the impossible had become ordinary. The dry red island that had defeated missionaries and sugarmen and cattle ranchers, the island George Vancouver had once found all but empty of life, was now the single most productive pineapple plantation on the face of the earth. On Lanai, hundreds of millions of pineapple plants stood in rows across some 20,000 acres of cultivated red dirt, the largest plantation of its kind anywhere in the world. In a good year, the island's fields gave up as much as 65,000 tons of fruit, and that fruit fed a machine of extraordinary reach. The Hawaiian pineapple industry that James Dole led grew roughly 3/4 of all the pineapple on the planet, canned it in 8 great canneries, and supplied the greater part of all the canned pineapple eaten in the United States, and much of the rest of the world's besides. By 1930, those canneries together were shipping more than 9 million cases of fruit a year. A fruit that most Americans had never seen at the turn of the century was now stacked by the 100 million cans in kitchens and on grocery shelves across the country. The minister's son had built one of the largest food empires in the world on a plant that everyone had told him would never travel. It was, by any measure, a staggering achievement, and, like most staggering achievements, it carried inside it the beginnings of its own undoing. The clearest sign of what was coming had nothing to do with pineapple, and everything to do with the man's growing appetite for the grand gesture. In the spring of 1927, inspired by Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic, and eager to prove that his fruit might one day reach the mainland by air rather than in the ships of his rivals, Dole announced a prize. 2 Honolulu newspapermen had wired him that the moment was, as their telegram put it, ripe for someone offer suitable prize non-stop flight Hawaii, and Dole took the bait. He offered $25,000 to the first aviator to fly non-stop from California to Hawaii, and $10,000 more for the second. What followed became known as the Dole Derby, and it was a catastrophe. The course ran more than 2,000 miles across open ocean at the very dawn of long-distance flight, and the dying began before the race did. 2 flyers were killed flying into the starting line in California. Another died in a test flight the next day. On the morning of the race itself, before a crowd of tens of thousands at Oakland, plane after plane crashed on takeoff or turned back with a failing engine. Of the 8 that started, only 2 reached Honolulu. 2 others vanished over the Pacific and were never seen again, despite a search by the warships of the United States Navy. One of the aircraft sent out to look for them disappeared as well. By the time the searching was done, 10 people were dead, and, with the 2 men lost while looking for the missing, the toll came to 12, among them a young schoolteacher from Michigan who had gone along as a passenger and who vanished somewhere in the water between the 2 coasts. Dole had wished for all the publicity a man could want. He had bought a tragedy that would carry his name for a century. The Dole Derby was a small thing beside the empire itself, but it was a true reading of the temper of the moment, the sense that the Pineapple King could reach for anything at all, and that the reaching had begun to outrun the reckoning. For a reckoning was coming, and it was written into the very nature of the business. A field of pineapple does not ripen on command. From planting to harvest, the crop takes roughly 2 years. The enormous harvest that made 1930 so triumphant had gone into the ground 2 years earlier, in the confident world of the late 1920s, and it was ripening now into a world that was about to vanish. On the mainland, the market that bought Dole's fruit was beginning to collapse, and the more of the world's pineapple a single company controlled, the farther that company had to fall. But the deepest danger to Dole's empire was not the failing market, nor the ripening crop, nor even his own appetite for the grand gesture. It was closer than any of those, and it had been sitting in his own boardroom since 1922. To understand how James Dole lost everything, one has to understand the men who truly ran Hawaii. The 5 great houses that controlled the ships, the ports, and the money of the islands, and who had been waiting with great patience for the Pineapple King to fall. Chapter 7. The Big Five and the Ships. James Dole may have been the Pineapple King, but he had never truly ruled Hawaii. The men who ruled Hawaii were the Big Five. They were 5 companies, closely intertwined: Castle and Cooke, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer, Theo H. Davies, and American Factors. Between them, they controlled the sugar that was the island's first industry, and from sugar they had reached outward until they held nearly everything else: the banking and the insurance, the utilities and the wholesale trade, the ports, and above all, the ships. Most of the 5 had grown out of the same soil as the Doles themselves, the missionary and merchant families of the previous century, the children of men who had come to Hawaii to save souls and had stayed to own the place. By the 1920s, they governed the territory not through any office that anyone had elected, but through a web of shared directorships, the same small circle of men sitting on one another's boards, deciding among themselves what the islands would grow, what those islands would pay, and how their goods would move. Nothing moved without the ships. The Big Five's hold on the sea ran through a single company, the Matson Navigation Company, of which Castle and Cooke was both an agent and a major shareholder, and Matson carried close to 4/5 of all the freight that entered or left the islands. To send anything to the mainland, from a ton of sugar to a case of pineapple, was to pay Matson, and the ships were only the most visible thread of a web that touched nearly everything. As one writer of the day described it, a resident of the islands paid a tiny tribute into Big Five coffers every time he switched on a light, lit the gas, or rode the streetcar to work. James Dole paid it too, and he resented it. Every can of pineapple he shipped east crossed the ocean at rates the oligarchy set, and the oligarchy was more and more inside his own company. The 1/3 interest he had handed to a Castle and Cooke concern in 1922 to buy Lanai had not stayed quietly in the background. It had bought Castle and Cooke seats in his boardroom and a standing voice in the direction of the company he had built, and that voice grew louder as the years passed. Dole did not submit easily. He clashed with the shipping interests over their rates and looked for carriers beyond Matson's reach, and the powerful men who ran those interests did not forget it. An account of his downfall would later conclude that when a company crossed the great transportation groups of the islands, they used every means to force it back into line, and that James Dole had become their unfortunate victim. They controlled the ships he needed. They held 1/3 of the company he had built, and they could afford, as men of their kind always could, to wait. For most of the 1920s, there was nothing to wait for. The Hawaiian Pineapple Company was the great success of the islands, and its founder's defiance could be indulged so long as the money kept coming in. But the men of Castle and Cooke were patient by temperament and by design, and patience is the cheapest weapon a powerful man owns. They did not need to move against James Dole. They needed only to be there, holding what they held, on the day he could no longer protect himself. That day was almost upon him. The great crop was ripening into a broken market. The company was about to begin losing money faster than any pineapple concern ever had, and the men who would decide what to do about it were not disinterested bankers weighing a troubled account. They were the rivals he had defied, seated in his own boardroom, holding a third of his company in their hands. The fingers had been closing for 10 years. In the winter of 1932, they closed. Chapter 8. The Fall of the Pineapple King. The end came the way the beginning had come, out of the peculiar biology of the pineapple. Because the fruit takes about 2 years from planting to harvest, the great crop that ripened in the early 1930s had been committed to the ground in the confident final years of the boom. It came up on schedule, magnificent and enormous, into a country that had just watched its stock market collapse and could no longer afford a luxury it had only lately learned to want. Canned pineapple was among the first things a frightened household stopped buying. The fields of Lanai and Oahu gave up their millions of fruit into warehouses that could not empty fast enough, and the price fell and kept falling. The numbers turned savage. In the first 9 months of 1931, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company lost more than $5 million. No pineapple concern had ever bled money at such a rate. Dole tried to save it. He had perfected a new and better pineapple juice, and he believed it could carry the company through, but promoting a new product costs money, and money was the one thing the company no longer had. The debt mounted. The board grew anxious, and the board, by this point, was no longer entirely his. In December of 1932, Castle and Cooke moved. Holding already the 1/3 interest Dole had handed them a decade earlier to buy his island, they acquired another block of stock, roughly 21% more, and with it a clear majority of the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. Then they removed its founder from the management of the business he had built out of nothing. James Dole was given a new title, Honorary Chairman, which is the kind of title a company awards a man precisely because it means nothing. Real control passed to a Castle and Cooke man, Atherton Richards. The Pineapple King had been dethroned inside his own kingdom by the men who had been sitting at his table since 1922. There was one last irony, and it lay in the name itself. Years earlier, his cousin Sanford had asked him to keep the family name off the product, feeling it belonged to the pulpit and the schoolhouse and not to trade. Dole had come around and stamped the word Dole on his cans all the same. But the name would not become a household word, and one of the most valuable trademarks on earth, until the company had passed out of his hands. It was the reorganized firm, run by the men who had taken his business, that built the Dole brand into what it remains today. They kept his name. They simply saw to it that it no longer belonged to him. He lingered at the edges of it for years, an honorary chairman with nothing to chair, and resigned at last in 1948. He died in Honolulu in 1958, an old man, and was buried on Maui, on a slope looking out over pineapple fields that had once been his and were his no longer. Whatever else is said of him, the line Shakespeare gave a grieving prince fits the Pineapple King as well. "I shall not look upon his like again." It is at this grave, the grave of the man who lost the island, that the oldest question in the whole story comes fully into the open. It is worth stopping on, because it is the question Lanai has been asking, in one form or another, from the beginning. James Dole lost his empire through a bargain he had made himself. Castle and Cooke broke no law. They exercised rights he had freely granted them. They bought stock that was there to be bought, and by every legal measure they did not steal his company. They acquired it. A willing man had signed the papers in 1922, and a decade later those papers came due. And yet almost no one who tells this story can quite bring themselves to call it fair. That same measure, set against the island itself, changes nothing and everything. The Baldwins sold Lanai, Dole bought it. A price was set and paid, a deed was signed and recorded, and by that measure nothing was stolen there either. The division of lands and the overthrow that had made the islands saleable in the first place were also, on paper, lawful acts, signed and recorded by the men who held the power to sign and record. So here is where the story asks you to decide, and I would like to know how you answer. If a signed contract and a paid price are enough to settle the matter, then nothing was ever taken on Lanai, not from Dole, and not from the people who lived there long before any Dole arrived. But if a legal sale can still be a kind of taking, if you feel, as many do, that something was stolen from the island's first people, no matter whose signature sat on the deed, then the same must be true, in its smaller way, of what was done to the Pineapple King. Say where you land, and say why. Was it all just business, willing sellers and willing buyers, and the ordinary hazards of ownership? Or was it a taking, dressed each time in the clothing of a contract? Name it in the comments. It is the kind of question that does not resolve, and reasonable people come down hard on opposite sides of it. James Dole was gone, but the island he had bought and the empire he had lost did not stop. They changed hands, as they always would, and went on without him. Chapter 9. The Company Century. James Dole was gone, but his company and his island went on without him for another 60 years. The Hawaiian Pineapple Company he had founded was absorbed, in 1961, fully into Castle and Cooke, which renamed it and ran it as a subsidiary. The name Dole survived, more famous than ever, but it was now only a brand owned by the oligarchy that had taken it. On Lanai, the fields went on producing, harvest after harvest, decade after decade, and the families who worked them went on living in the company town, in the company houses, buying from the company store, as their parents and grandparents had before them. But the world that had built the plantation was changing, and the people of Lanai helped to change it. The children and grandchildren of the imported workers were not willing to accept $1 a day and a life ordered from end to end by the company. After the Second World War, they organized. A brief strike in 1947 failed, but in 1951, 800 pineapple workers on Lanai walked off the fields and stayed off them for 201 days through a long and hungry stretch in which the Union Hall became a soup kitchen until the company gave in. It was called the Great Pineapple Strike, and the workers won it. Across the islands, the Longshoremen's Union came to represent a majority of Hawaii's farm laborers, the first and only state where that had ever been done. Wages rose and kept rising until the men and women who picked pineapple in Hawaii were the best-paid agricultural workers anywhere on earth. It was a real victory, won by the descendants of people who had been carried across an ocean to labor for $1 a day, and it carried inside it, like the great harvest of 1930, the seed of an ending. For the world would not pay Hawaiian wages for a fruit it could buy more cheaply somewhere else. In the Philippines, in Thailand, in Costa Rica, the same work could be done for something close to 1/10 of what it cost in the islands. The arithmetic was without mercy. Hawaii's share of the world's pineapple, once the greater part of it, fell away year by year. And so the great companies did what companies do. They followed the cheap labor. Dole and the others moved their fields and their canneries abroad, to the very countries that could grow the fruit for a fraction of the Hawaiian price. And here the circle of this story closes, quietly, and with a cruelty that no one seems to have intended. The company that had once carried thousands of Filipino men and women across the Pacific to grow pineapple on Lanai now sent the work itself back in the other direction, to the very Philippines they had come from. The great-grandchildren of the people Dole had imported in the 1920s stood in the fields of Lanai and watched the fruit that had built their town, their harbor, and their whole way of life sail away toward the country their own families had left 3 generations before. They had won the highest farm wages in the world, and winning them had helped to end the only work the island had ever known. The pineapple was dying on Lanai. The company that owned the island had grown distant and distracted, losing interest in a crop it could raise more profitably 10,000 miles away. And into that long decline, in the middle of the 1980s, stepped a new kind of owner. Not a planter and not one of the old island houses, but a single financier from the mainland who would come to own the whole island almost by accident, end its pineapple for good, and try to sell Lanai something it had never been before. Chapter 10. The Raider. The man who ended the pineapple never much cared about pineapple. David Murdoch was a mainland financier, a self-made man who had climbed out of Depression-era poverty with almost no schooling and a hard talent for buying troubled companies cheaply. He did not come to Lanai looking for an island. In 1985, he brought his own company into a merger with Castle and Cooke, which was near bankruptcy, because he wanted what a failing conglomerate can offer a clever buyer: its valuable real estate, and its enormous tax losses. Castle and Cooke owned the Dole Company, and the Dole Company owned Lanai, and so 98% of a Hawaiian island passed to David Murdoch almost as an afterthought, a parcel attached to a financial maneuver, the way a title office might convey a vacant lot. He had no use for the pineapple, which by then could be grown for 1/10 of the cost in Asia, and he wound it down. In October of 1992, the last commercial harvest on Lanai came in, ending 70 years. On the 14th of November, the people of the island gathered in Dole Park, in the center of the town Dole had built for a pauhana, the Hawaiian words for the end of the workday, and mourned the close of the only industry the island had ever had. A newspaper covering the gathering described a community watching its way of life vanish. The fields that had once held pineapple by the hundreds of millions went quiet and then to weeds. In place of the pineapple, Murdoch sold something new. He built 2 grand resorts, the Lodge at Ko'ela in the cool uplands in 1990, and the Manel Bay Hotel above the sea in 1991, and laid out golf courses with the names of Jack Nicklaus and Greg Norman attached to them. The island that had grown fruit for the world's grocery shelves now sold quiet and luxury to the world's wealthy. The descendants of the men and women who had once picked pineapple for $1 a day now changed the linens and carried the bags. The master had changed, and the product had changed from fruit to solitude. The one thing that did not change was the arrangement. Lanai was still owned in its near entirety by a single man who did not live there. And Murdoch owned it in every sense. He ran the island as a personal domain and took to calling its residents, in public, his children. He poured money into the place and lost it, year upon year, somewhere between $20 and $40 million annually, and he said of Lanai, without apparent embarrassment, that it was the poorest financial investment I've made in my entire life. And yet he did not let it go. He held on for nearly 3 decades, a mainland billionaire presiding over 3,000 people and their homes and their water and their work, because the island was his, and a man does not easily surrender what is his. His grandest scheme was the one that turned much of the island against him. Murdoch proposed to cover a stretch of Lanai with as many as 200 enormous wind turbines, a project called Big Wind, and to send the power they made by undersea cable to the city of Honolulu on another island entirely. The turbines would rise over ground that many residents held sacred, land bearing ancient rock carvings and the bones of their ancestors. The island split bitterly between those who wanted the jobs and those who would not see the graves of their forebears turned into a generating station for a city that was not theirs. The plan came to nothing, but it revealed more clearly than anything else how Murdoch saw the place he owned. Not as a home that happened to be his property, but as a property that happened to contain some homes. In the end, the arithmetic beat him, as it had beaten Dole. Murdoch never made Lanai pay, and in 2012, worn down by the losses and by the neglect those losses had bred, he agreed to sell the island to another man. But even in letting go, he did not entirely let go. When the sale closed, David Murdoch kept for himself the rights to the wind, still hoping one day to raise his turbines over an island he no longer owned. The buyer was richer than Dole and Murdoch, and the whole of the Big Five combined, and he meant to own Lanai more completely than any of them ever had. Chapter 11. For 70 years, Lanai had been the Pineapple Island. It was known by what it produced and by the thousands of people who produced it. A working island, a company island, but an island with a life of its own, loud with baseball games and weddings and the labor of ordinary families. When the pineapple ended, that identity ended with it. Lanai became something new, and the new thing carried a different name. It became a private island. A private island is defined not by what it makes, but by who owns it, and Lanai, in the years after the last harvest, became a destination for people who could afford to be alone. The resorts Murdoch had built drew the wealthiest men in the world. On the first day of 1994, Bill Gates, then the second richest man in America, was married on a golf course on Lanai, beside a hole that looks out over the Pacific. To keep his wedding private, Gates booked every one of the 250 rooms in the Manali Bay Hotel and hired every helicopter on the neighboring island of Maui so that no photographer could pass overhead. For one weekend, an island where 3,000 people made their homes became, in effect, a single billionaire's private garden. The people who lived there understood exactly what that meant, because they had been living inside it for generations. When reporters tried to reach the shoreline to glimpse the wedding, they were stopped and handed a printed warning that their presence was no longer welcome, because the beaches and the roads and the cliffs were, the notice explained, all lands owned by Castle and Cooke. Not most of the land, all of it. A visitor could be escorted off an entire inhabited island of the United States because the ground beneath the whole of it belonged to a company. And the names told the same story the deeds did. The square at the center of town, where the community gathered for its celebrations and had gathered to mourn the end of the pineapple, was called Dole Park, after the man who had once owned every soul in it. The island was known to the world as the Pineapple Island, or as Dole's Island, or as the place where the billionaires got married. It was named always for its crops and for its owners. It was almost never named for the people who actually lived on it, and it was never any longer named for the people who had lived on it first. For those people, and for the roughly 3,000 who remained, Lanai was not a resort or a getaway or an investment. It was home. It was the only home most of them had ever known, the place their great-grandparents had been carried to, the ground in which their dead were buried, and they lived in it as their ancestors had, in houses they did not own, working for whoever held the deed, watching their island appear in glossy magazines as the backdrop for other people's holidays. It was a home to the people who lived there, and a possession to the people who owned it, and across 100 years those two things had never once been the same. That was Lanai as it stood at the close of the 20th century. A dry, beautiful place, its pineapple gone, its people renting, its every acre held by a distant company grown weary of losing money on it. It was waiting, though no one put it that way, for someone rich enough to want it as a possession, a thing to have rather than a thing to run. Bill Gates had rented the island's silence for a single weekend, and then given it back. The man who came next had no intention of giving it back. In the summer of 2012, Lanai was sold again, whole, the way it had always been sold, and this time it passed to one of the richest men who has ever lived. Chapter 12. The Billionaire Buys the Island. In June of 2012, Larry Ellison, the co-founder of the software company Oracle and one of the richest men who has ever lived, bought the island of Lanai. Not a house on it, and not a share of the company that ran it, the island. He paid a reported $300 million, though some accounts put the figure higher, and for that sum he received the same 98% that had passed from Dole to Castle and Cooke to Murdoch, 87,000 of the island's 90,000 acres. To say that a man owns an island is easy. It is worth pausing on what he actually owned. Ellison owned both of the Four Seasons resorts, which provided most of the jobs on Lanai. He owned about a third of all the housing on the island, the roofs over the heads of the people who lived there. He owned the company that supplied the island's water and the system that carried away its waste. He owned the only true grocery store and the only gas station and the community newspaper and the only hotel that was not one of his resorts, and very nearly every commercial building in the single small town. Overnight, for the 3,000 people of Lanai, one man had become their landlord or their employer, and, for a great many of them, both at once. The company he formed to manage it all, called Pulama Lanai, became the largest employer on the island with a workforce of some 400. It was the company town again, and it was more total than Dole's had ever been. Dole had owned the land, and the store, and the work. Ellison owned all of that, and the water in the taps, and the gas in the pumps, and the news on the doorstep besides. And woven into the arrangement was a detail that Dole, for all his power, had never quite set down so plainly. A provision in the residential leases held that a tenant who was fired from a job with one of Ellison's companies could also be removed from an Ellison home. On an island where so many both worked for the man and rented from him, the person who signed a family's paycheck and the person who could put that family out of its house were the same person. The leases on the small shops of the town, once written for years at a time, were now often written 30 days at a time. Ellison did not buy Lanai to leave it as it was. He vowed to remake the whole island into what he called a model for the globe, a place run entirely on clean energy, its old plantation fields reborn as high-technology farms that might one day help feed the world. And he spent on that vision as only he could. He put a reported $450 million into remodeling a single one of his 2 resorts. He built a Nobu and a wellness retreat that charged $3,000 a night, and vast greenhouses lit by 1,600 solar panels. For the residents, he refurbished the shuttered movie theater and built an Olympic-sized swimming pool, And in 2022, he broke ground on the first new affordable housing the island had seen in nearly 30 years. And still, more than a decade on, the grand vision has stayed just out of reach. The farms that were meant to feed the world have struggled to supply the islands next door, and drew open criticism for basic mistakes. The plan to buy out the island's diesel utility and turn it green was announced, and then quietly cancelled. In the autumn of 2025, the company closed the division that had built its luxury homes, and 15 people lost their work. The dream of a perfectly sustainable island remains a dream, and the man who dreamed it has largely gone, keeping his main home now thousands of miles away on the far coast of Florida, an owner who governs his island mostly in absence. He has been called, without much exaggeration, a contemporary American king. A private citizen who owns an inhabited island of the United States and nearly everything on it, whose signature on a lease can turn a family out of its home, and who rules the place from 3,000 miles off. And here I want to stop the story and ask you something directly, because this is the argument the people of Lanai and the people who watch Lanai seem to have without end. To some, Larry Ellison is a benefactor, a man pouring hundreds of millions of his own dollars into a small, forgotten place that Murdoch had left to decay, keeping it alive when no one else would. To others, he is something older and colder, the lord of a modern fiefdom, a man to whom whole families owe both their wages and their roof, on an island where some of those families work 3 and 4 jobs and still cannot get ahead. So make the case for me, either way. If you have lived on Lanai or worked for the man or walked those resorts as a guest, put it in the comments and settle it. A rich man's rescue or a rich man's kingdom? Because that argument, for all its heat, belongs to the present day. Beneath it lies an older question, and a harder one, that reaches back past Ellison and Murdoch and Dole, all the way to the beginning. It is the question of how Lanai became a thing that a man could own at all. Chapter 13. The New Company Town. For nearly the whole of its human history, Lanai was not property at all. Under the old Hawaiian order, land was held and stewarded and belonged to, bound up in a web of duty between chiefs and gods and the people who worked it, but it was not a thing one man could own to the exclusion of every other. That changed in the middle of the 19th century. In 1848, in a division of lands remembered as the Mahele, the Hawaiian kingdom was pressed to cut its earth into parcels and turn those parcels into private property, deeds that could be bought and mortgaged and lost. Within a single generation, the greater part of Hawaii had passed out of native Hawaiian hands. And in 1893, a small circle of American businessmen and sugar planters, one of them named Sanford Dole, overthrew the Hawaiian queen. 5 years after that, the United States annexed the islands outright. So, when James Dole sailed to Lanai and bought it in 1922, the thing he purchased, a whole island held as one man's private property, had been made buyable only a lifetime before by the generation of his own cousin. The island could be sold to a pineapple merchant because it had first been taken from a people. This is the current that runs beneath the entire story, under every name in it. Gibson and the Baldwins, Dole and Castle and Cooke, Murdoch and Ellison. Every one of them bought Lanai, or sold it, as a parcel of real estate. But the first of those transfers was not a sale at all. It was a seizure, dressed in the language of law. The island has changed hands for money a dozen times. It was taken without payment only once, and everything since has been the resale of that first taking. And so Lanai today is what it has been for 100 years. It is a company town. Roughly 3,000 people live there still. Most of them are the great-grandchildren of the Japanese, Filipino, Portuguese, Korean, and Puerto Rican laborers who were carried across an ocean to grow a fruit that has not been raised commercially on the island since 1992. They rent their houses from the man who owns the island. They draw their wages from him. The pineapple is gone, and the arrangement remains. One owner has simply followed another, all the way down the length of the century, and the people have stayed tenants through every change of name at the top of the deed. And the people whose island it was before any of it, the native Hawaiians, are more and more not on it at all. Priced out of the islands their ancestors held for 1,000 years, they have been leaving, by the thousands every year, for the mainland. By many counts, there are now more native Hawaiians living on the American continent than in Hawaii itself. So many have gathered in a single desert city that Las Vegas, of all places, has come to be called the Ninth Island. They keep their language and their songs and their aloha alive 3,000 miles from the sea in the Nevada desert, while the island that bore their name is owned by a man who lives on the coast of Florida. Some of them, when they speak of it, will say that the hardest part of leaving was the ground itself, the graves of their parents and grandparents, left behind in a homeland they can now afford only to visit. And none of this is new. It began, as so much on Lanai began, at Palawai, the wide bowl of red earth at the island's heart, where the Mormon mission had once tried to plant its colony. There, around 1862, a boy named Kiha Ka'awa was born. In 1873, still a child, he became one of the first native Hawaiians ever granted leave to quit the islands for good, carried off to the American mainland with the missionaries. He grew up in Utah, married there, raised his children there, and died there, in Salt Lake City, in 1931. An old man who had left a village on Lanai as a boy and never once returned. He was among the very first to make that crossing. The families boarding their flights to Las Vegas are making it still, a century and a half later. What it would mean to give any of it back, and to whom, is a question with no easy answer. To the plantation families who built the island's one town and buried their own dead in its red soil. To the native Hawaiians whose kingdom was taken before the first pineapple was ever planted. These are not settled matters. They are being argued now, in Hawaiian courtrooms and legislatures and living rooms, with more heat and more seriousness each passing year. And the pattern built on Lanai did not stay on Lanai. The very house that owned the island, Castle and Cooke, helped carry the company town system far beyond Hawaii into the ports and plantations of Central America, where an allied fruit empire would buy up land, break its workers, and unseat elected governments, and hand the world a name for a whole nation owned and run like a plantation. The Banana Republic. But that is a story for another day. I have told you this story from the outside, from ledgers and land records and the words of people long dead. But some of you know it from the inside, in a way no archive ever will. If you live on Lanai now, or your family picked its pineapple, or you carry the blood of the people who held that island before it was ever bought or sold, you know things these records do not. Say so in the comments below. This account is better for your voice in it, and so is the memory of the place. There are more of them than one channel could ever reach. Other islands, other company towns, other fortunes that rose on ground, taken from someone else, and fell into a silence just as complete. I cannot get to them all on my own, and I would rather not choose them all on my own. So if there is a place, a family, a company, a stretch of American ground whose story you believe deserves this kind of telling, put it in the comments and point me to it. Empire of Acres exists for one purpose: to trace how the places of this country were made and taken, and by whom. If that is the history you want kept and told, subscribe and stay. The Pineapple Kings are gone now. Dole is a word stamped on a can. Murdoch is left with his losses and his rusting ambitions. Ellison has his resorts and his greenhouses and his house on the far shore. And Lanai remains, as it has through all of them, dry and red and beautiful, ringed by the same ocean that carried every owner to it and will, in time, carry away every owner yet to come. The deeds will change hands again. They always have. But beneath every deed ever drawn upon that island lies an older and quieter claim, the claim of the people who were there before the first survey, before the first sail, before the first man ever looked at an island full of the living and the dead, and saw in it a thing that could be owned. That claim has never been settled, and on Lanai, as across the whole of these islands, it is only now, after 100 years and more, beginning to be heard.